In Essential Task 5.3, we are going to talk about specific motivation systems. And to be more specific, we're going to talk about hunger, sex drive, and the theory of needs. Now, of course, this isn't a total list of all of our drives. There are other drives, like the primary drive of thirst, which we talked about in 5.2, but we're going to highlight the ones that I think are more likely to appear on the AP exam. I recommend a horizontal piece of paper for this concept map, and I will allow you now to pause the video before we continue onward into the concept map. We're going to start there with hunger and specifically break down some of the biological reasons we experience hunger and then some of the environmental. The first biological reason we experience hunger is the stimulation of what's called a stomach contraction, or as we sort of culturally say, your stomach growling. In studies, we've had individuals who sort of swallowed this balloon that measures stomach contractions. You can kind of see a visual of that here. Those individuals were then asked to press this key every time they experienced hunger. And what we found is there's a correlation between stomach contractions and hunger. So that is, in fact, one of the physical sensations that can occur that facilitates that hunger drive. But what is interesting is if your stomach is removed, you would actually still experience hunger. There are still other things going on behind the scenes beyond just your stomach that could facilitate hunger. So we need to look a little bit further. There are more biological reasons. One is really going back to one of the physiological benefits of eating in the first place, which is to sort of boost your energy levels, help reverse low glucose levels, low blood glucose levels, which can occur throughout the day. When you return home from school at noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, at whatever time you get home, it's not inconceivable that your blood glucose levels are actually quite low, certainly if you haven't eaten throughout the day. Well, going to the fridge and eating lunch or eating a snack is one of the ways we can reverse that. These low blood glucose levels are another biological explanation for what triggers hunger. The third is what we call the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is a region of the brain. We're going to talk more about the brain and the hypothalamus in a later unit. So it has more functions than just food. It has connections to things like thirst and the sex drive, the endocrine system, and some other topics. But we're going to talk about the hypothalamus in this unit exclusively about food. Hypothalamus is a region of the brain, and if we break down sort of what region of the hypothalamus that we're talking about, we can see that the hypothalamus has two different functions in the context of hunger. The region known as the lateral hypothalamus is the region of your brain that is stimulated when you feel hungry, specifically as a result of the hunger hormone called ghrelin. More about that in a little bit. When this region of the brain is stimulated, you experience that sensation of hunger. So you could theoretically, as we talked about a moment ago, have your stomach removed, but still actually feel hunger because the lateral hypothalamus was stimulated. If this region of your brain was lesioned, which is a word that we use for damaged, you would actually not experience that degree of hunger. Your lateral hypothalamus would be damaged. It's sort of the on and off switch for hunger. Well, if you can't flip it on, you can't experience hunger. So as a mnemonic, when I look at the word lateral, I isolate the L in lateral, and I think L for little. This mnemonic only works if you remember what happens when the lateral hypothalamus is damaged. Well, you'd become very little because you'd stop feeling hungry, and we've seen this in studies using animals, that when the lateral hypothalamus is damaged, whether intentionally or through the results of brain damage or a tumor, you would have animals that simply choose not to eat, or eat very, very little. Why? Because they never experience that physical sensation of hunger. Well, there is an opposing side of the hypothalamus called the ventral medial hypothalamus, which basically does the opposite. If the lateral hypothalamus is the on switch to eat, the ventral medial hypothalamus is the off switch. It's the region of the hypothalamus that is stimulated when you feel full. And the hormones that start to shift when you start to eat trigger that feeling of satiety, meaning that you feel full. The ventral medial hypothalamus is stimulated. Well, in the same vein, if this is lesioned or damaged, you would sort of never have that off switch. You would continue to eat and eat and eat. And in some cases, animals that have damage to the ventral medial hypothalamus will basically eat until their stomach explodes. They'll truly eat themselves to death, as you can kind of see with that picture there at the bottom. Again, we're going to use a mnemonic. The only way the two mnemonics here work, and this is really important, is if you remember that they work under the assumption that this region of the brain is damaged. So when I look at ventral medial hypothalamus, I take the V and the H in ventromedial and H in hypothalamus, and I think of the phrase very huge. You'd become very huge if your ventral medial hypothalamus was damaged, or perhaps if there was a tumor. If something was causing the ventral medial hypothalamus not to function properly, you could very easily eat way beyond what is necessary to sustain your energy levels and satisfy your hunger. The fourth biological concept, this is the furthest down the box goes, is what's called set point theory. For anyone who's tried to lose weight, this term's kind of frustrating. Set point theory argues that everybody has a set weight. It's likely inherited, it's this biological set point that your body would like to stay at. So for some people, that might be 150 pounds, 250. It varies per person. And when you diet or exercise and drop below the set point, your body then overcompensates, changing hormone levels, increasing your appetite and your hunger, slowing your metabolism, really essentially working behind the scenes automatically, the things that you don't really have control over, to try and push your weight back up to your set point. Meaning if your set point is above where you would like to be, every time you diet and exercise to drop to an ideal weight, at least in your opinion, your body is then going to fight back against that weight loss, dropping your metabolism, increasing your hunger, changing your hormone levels in order to compensate so you can return back and actually gain weight and go back to that set point. So, for example, when you feel satisfied and full, one of the hunger hormones that is present is a hormone called leptin. Well, leptin is less active when you're below your set point, meaning your appetite, your desire to feel full doesn't occur as frequently. Why? Because your body's kind of pulling back and saying, no, you're not full, keep eating. You are 10 pounds below your set point. We need to get back up to that set point, which, of course, for anyone who's tried to diet can be incredibly, incredibly frustrating. There's a visual or a video here that I'd like you to watch. Only watch about the first minute 15. At the end of this video, he starts to try and sell you a diet plan and like a magic approach, and I don't want you to watch that part. Watch up to a minute 15. It'll talk about specifically the set point theory before he kind of goes off into his tangent about his own dieting practices. And there's an optional TED Talk here to watch too. The last part of this box to connect, though, are the two hunger hormones. Ghrelin, which we talked about a moment ago, is the hormone that's present that enables hunger, at least partially enables hunger. And I look at the word ghrelin and I think of the word gremlin. And I always think about when your stomach growls, it's like a growling little gremlin. Well, that's what's going to trigger hunger activation with the lateral hypothalamus. Leptin, which we referenced a moment ago with set point theory, is the hormone that can partially inform your body that you're full, that you feel quote unquote loaded, L for leptin and L for loaded. That's the I'm full hormone. And the connection here is that when you are below your set point, when your weight is below that sort of predefined biological weight that your body wants to be, it starts to pull back on the use of leptin, hopefully causing you to eat more and gain that weight back. So there are more than just biological reasons why we eat, though. There are some environmental reasons why we eat. First is that we're in a social situation where eating is just expected, or quite frankly, just because we saw food. So, for example, you could choose to eat at home because you're trying to save money. You have a full meal, and then you go out to eat with your friends. So you're at a restaurant, everyone's eating, people are talking about what they're ordering. It's sort of a social expectation that you order something too. And then somebody actually gets their food and you see French fries and you're like, okay, not only am I going to eat fries, I'm going to order fries. I am actually hungry. I went out of my way to avoid hunger before coming here, but I'm not only just going to eat, I actually can feel the sensation of hunger. I am driven to eat. So whether it was the social expectation or actually just physically seeing food, those are what we call external hunger cues, something in the environment that triggered the sensation of hunger. Your memory and routine can also trigger hunger. So for example, if you're really used to eating at noon, that's part of your routine. If you look up at the clock and say, wow, it's 12:30, I haven't eaten yet, that can be enough to trigger the sensation of hunger, and then you could subsequently eat. Additionally, if it's just simply been a long time since you've last eaten, and you don't really fully remember the last time you've eaten, even if prior to thinking about that, you weren't really hungry, that could be enough to trigger the hunger sensation. Individuals that have anterograde amnesia, again, are patients that can form no new memories, so they cannot form new memories. No new is the mnemonic that we used back in Unit 1. Patients with anterograde amnesia will actually continue to eat if presented with meals, even in short windows of time. So I'm talking like every 30 minutes, they're offered lunch. Well, those patients will actually consecutively eat lunch, even though they ate a lunch 30 minutes ago. Why? Well, it's not because their stomach is growling. It's probably not because of blood glucose levels. It's probably just because they don't remember the last time they ate. Remember? Anterograde amnesia, no new memories. So whether it's your recollection of the last time you ate or just your personal routine looking up at the clock and realizing it's 12:30, those are all examples of environmental cues in our environment that can trigger hunger that have nothing to do with our hypothalamus or our stomach contractions or glucose levels or set point theory or any of the biological things that we previously talked about. This leaves us now with two remaining columns. The sex drive is one that we're not going to overly emphasize, but nevertheless, we will talk about a contributing psychologist named Alfred Kinsey, because he's a pretty interesting individual. And historically, he has a role in the study of sex education, which I think is important. So Kinsey conducted most of his work in the 40s and then into the 50s. He really gets credited for being one of the first scientists, whether you want to call him a psychologist or just a scientist, who focused a lot on trying to study human sexuality, and he used sort of an anonymous survey format to compile a lot of data. And he asked some really personal questions about sex preferences, whether it's quantity of partners, whether it's you're homosexual or heterosexual, and really a variety of topics that in the 40s and 50s were a little bit more taboo than they are now. Then he took all that data and he compiled it into a bunch of writing. And what was quite surprising at the time is that the societal expectations of most people did not match what Kinsey found. Kinsey found that people were way more sexual than the societal expectations were, whether that was in terms of partners or the frequency to which members of society identified as homosexual or bisexual. That ultimately people were way more sex-driven than any of the sort of societal expectations seemed to indicate prior to his work. At the time, there's plenty of people that really pushed back on Kinsey. Certainly what he was offering in his writing didn't match the sort of conservative cultural expectations of the 40s and 50s, but nevertheless, his work was still really important. The Time magazine cover in the bottom left corner is a really famous one. It's a picture of Kinsey, sort of the birds and the bees background, where the Time magazine article really went in great depth into his study and some of the arguments that he was making relative to the time period that, again, were pretty surprising to people. As a little silly mnemonic, I look at his last name, I add a K in it, and I call him Kinky Kinsey. He's one of the only psychologists we talk about who talks about the sex drive. I guess it's probably him and Freud who are the only two that will ever really talk about that. The final box all the way to the right is something called the theory of needs. And we're going to talk about a gentleman by the name of David McClelland. McClelland offered up an explanation for what motivates us that oftentimes gets related to the workplace. So this applies to more than just the workplace, but you often see this phenomenon, this concept applied to workplace dynamics. And we're actually going to do that ourselves in our classwork. McClelland basically argued that there are three primary motivators that are influenced by our own personal experiences and cultures: the need to achieve, the need for power, and the need for affiliation. And each of these sort of work in tandem with one another to dictate our motivations. And that some people are really high in one, really low in the other. Maybe you're high in two, low in one, high across the board, low across the board. Really, it depends on the person. But there are really three main primary motivators beyond like hunger and thirst. That's a whole different topic. We're talking about things that motivate you, for example, at work: achievement, power, and affiliation. And again, as I referenced a moment ago, each of these are influenced by your own personal experiences and the culture that you live in. So again, we talked about this back in Unit 3, but the United States is a very individualistic culture relative to others. That certainly plays a huge role in how Americans, relative to other places on Earth, relate to each of these. Individuals that classify as high achievers, or at least have that need for achievement, are individuals that really like to exceed, really like to excel, really like to accomplish things. Really highly competitive. What's really fascinating, though, about what McClelland found is that people who are high achievement, yes, they like to be successful, but they don't like to do easy things. They don't like to say, well, I can do these 10 basic addition questions and celebrate my great accomplishment. No, that's too easy. But they also don't want to do things that they know are impossible. They have very realistic evaluations of what tasks are challenging but not impossible. So they seek out challenges. They actually seek out challenges, but challenges that are of moderate difficulty. Not impossible, or else you're going to fail. And if you're seeking high levels of achievement, you obviously don't want to fail. But it's not an achievement to beat a 5-year-old at a game of chess or a game of checkers. Like, that doesn't mean anything. People who are high on the achievement scale are always seeking out, as the name kind of indicates, challenging tasks that do push them, but are not impossible. People that score high on the Big Five trait of conscientiousness typically do well in terms of achievement. There's a strong correlation between those two. Again, correlation is not causation, but nevertheless, a high correlation between high levels of conscientiousness and high levels of achievement. The one for power might come across as a negative, but I want to make it really clear that people who are high in power are not necessarily power hungry, as you might interpret, but these are people that like to make others behave in a way they wouldn't normally. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Basically, anyone who is a real leader, whether that's a sports coach, even a teacher, whether it's your boss or your supervisor, like those are people that are making others act the way they wouldn't normally, right? If you're a teacher and you ask your students to do something, those students probably wouldn't have done that on their own. If you're a football coach and you ask your players to run a lap, they probably wouldn't do that on their own. So the way it comes across has a really negative connotation to it, but this isn't power hungry. These are just individuals that, in many ways like to have control over the outcome of the things they are involved in. And they want to lead the group through troubling times. They want to lead the group through business decisions. They want to lead the group through challenging moments in sporting events, because at the end of the day, they kind of trust their own perceptions and their own judgments more than other people's. They can sometimes doubt the capability of others and say, you know what, I think my judgment here is probably more well-rounded than others. I think we should go with my decision. So they seek the power, not necessarily to be power hungry, but just because they really trust their own ability and their own judgment. Individuals that score high in power might be pretty low in the agreeableness scale, to go back to the big 5 personality traits that we talked about a unit ago. The last one is what's called affiliation, and individuals that seek high levels of affiliation really desire those close, connected friendships and relationships. Oftentimes those connections can reduce anxiety, and from an evolutionary psychologist perspective, anytime you feel less anxious because you have those connections, whether it's to your clan, community, team, town, whatever it might be, that can really help promote your survival when you feel that connectiveness. Overall, individuals that are high in the affiliation scale tend to really value cooperation as the team over competition. It's in many ways the opposite in that essence with achievement. Now, I'm not saying you can't have high achievement and high affiliation. It's just the underlying premise of affiliation is, let's have the team succeed. Yes, I'm competitive, but I want everybody in my team to succeed, as opposed to the high achievement scale, which might be a little bit more individualized. You can still have high in both, but there is a clear discrepancy that would need to be parsed out to make some of the subtle differences clear between those two. In this course, there's a handful of careers that we need to define. Not too many, but this is an example of one of them. I would like you to watch the entire YouTube clip that's attached. But we're going to connect this final box. We're in the final box of this concept map, because the position known as industrial organizational psychologists are very closely connected with the ideas that we just established from McClelland. The idea of evaluating, perhaps in a workplace, who is high achievement, who is high power, who likes affiliation. Industrial organizational psychologists study business efficiency, management styles, sort of big picture structures that exist in a business, not necessarily the profit part. So this isn't marketing. This isn't people trying to develop new ideas. This is not research and design. This is what practices can be put in place to enable the workers at this job to succeed. What type of management style and relationships between coworkers, between management and coworkers, what needs to be put into place so that work can be synthesized and improved and efficient, not necessarily so that we make the best product. I mean, yeah, that's probably a byproduct of all of this, but this isn't that profit-driven, let's come at this from a marketing perspective, business perspective. Let's worry about the efficiencies, how the business runs, what's the schedule going to look like, what's the communication systems going to look like, what's the planning and goals going to look like, how are we going to run the most efficient and effective overall structure. And then oftentimes, if this is done, the profits will come sort of by virtue of having an efficient workplace.